Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is Dr. Grace Estrada, and we are in Psych 18 Research Methods, covering Chapter 3, Research Ethics. Can everyone see the screen? Someone just let me know.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so just to recap, remember we have goals in behavioral research. There's describe, for example, how do children make new friends? So when the goal is description, it's simply to understand the phenomenon deeper, maybe identify the variables that are there. That's it, just learn more about the condition. There is predict, for example, will wearing red attract more attention? So you can't really have a goal of prediction unless you already have the variables in place. So description provides knowledge about the variables that exist in a phenomenon or concept. Prediction is when now you're trying to see the relationship among the variables, like as in, does the presence of one variable help us anticipate a future behavior? Then there's determining cause. So does doing more homework result in higher grades? So in a way, you can sort of look at like, well, that's sort of like prediction, but what we're also looking, it's a deeper level than just prediction. Now it's, okay, we have an idea that this variable helps us anticipate, but why? Why does it do that? Why does it have that effect on the other variable? Remember that in research designs, the only one that can establish causation is an experiment, because with an experiment, you're actually manipulating one variable to see if that manipulation will result in a change in the other variable. So the variable you manipulate is called the independent variable, and the one that you measure afterwards is the dependent variable. So only an experiment can determine cause. Then there's the idea of controlling or explaining behavior, like why do people giggle? So now we understand the variables. We have a sense of the way the variables are interacting with each other. If there's, one is causing a change in the other. So now, what is it we can do to mitigate the behavior? So when we're doing research, something to consider is, why do we want to know what we want to know, right? What's our underlying cause? What's the motivation? How is it important that we know? Those are two really big considerations, and what helps guide us in what we're researching is our topic today, which is ethics. So keep in mind as we go through this, the idea is, why do we want to know this about people? And how important is it that we know? All right, so history of ethics codes. In the beginning, we didn't have ethics codes. We kind of relied on people to know intuitively what was right, the difference between right and wrong. Well, we found out fairly quickly with the Nazi trials and everything that not everyone had the same sense of what is right and wrong. And so the Nuremberg Code was developed in 1947 after the Nazi trials. What it introduced was, first and foremost, the idea of weighing the risks and benefits. So that is those two questions that I asked you. What do we want to know, and how important is it that we know? If what we want to know can cause harm to others, how much harm is acceptable? Those kind of ideas. So that's the idea of weighing the risks and benefits. When we weigh the risks and benefits, it's important to convey to anyone who may participate in our studies that they're taking this risk by participating in the study. And that's the idea behind informed consent. So the Nuremberg Code of 1947 brought this to the forefront, that first of all, researchers should weigh the risks and benefits, the benefits being to society, right? And then that once we understand to the best of our knowledge what those risks are, that we need to share them with anyone who might participate in our study. Then in 1964, there was the World Medical Council developed the Declaration of Helsinki. And that one actually brought forth the idea of having a protocol. So a protocol is the official description of what the study will be. So in this class, we're going to have a proposal. The proposal will form the basis of a protocol. Before anybody can conduct any kind of study, you need to have these two things. First of all, the proposal, the idea that's really a codification of what the researcher wants to pursue, how they're going to pursue it. And then you put it into a form that will be presented to an institutional review board, and we'll talk about who that is, who will assess whether any danger could possibly occur to the participants. So it is an official body who will actually do the weighing of the risks and benefits after you have done it, because we can't be certain that everybody has the same idea of what will be beneficial and what is risky to people. So the Belmont Report of 1979, so we had the Nuremberg Code of 1947, there was the Declaration of Helsinki 1964, then we had the Belmont Report. That resulted from the Tuskegee syphilis trials, which is one of the things that you're going to look at. So the idea there, that was from the United States, and it introduced really important ethical ideas. So one is justice, right? So people who are participating should be ones benefiting, right? Vice versa, and vice versa. Those who benefit from it should be also part of the group that participates. Respect for people. So it's important not to target vulnerable populations. Vulnerable populations include children, prisoners, the elderly, the infirm, people who may not, for whatever reason, be able to fully understand what it is they're getting into if they become participants. So again, the idea of protecting, right? That idea of beneficence, again, weighing the risks and benefits. Is the study beneficial enough to society or particular group that we should really pursue it? Again, the idea of maximizing the benefits while minimizing the risk. And so the Belmont Report is really what established the basis for the Institutional Review Board. And it affected all federally funded institutions. So when we talk about principle of respect for persons, what we're doing is we are respecting people as individuals. So anyone who participates in a study, if at any point they are uncomfortable with it or feel like they no longer want to do it, they should be allowed to leave, because that's what we're talking about with autonomy. There are people we respect that if for some reason they no longer want to participate, we will not stop them. We are also going to give them informed consent. So the informed consent is actually, well, now it's online, but it's a way of conveying to the people essentially what is going to happen in the study. And so this comes up with the question, especially in psychology, is that, well, we don't always want to tell people what we're studying for because people won't be honest. So there are some situations where as a researcher, you might want to engage in a little bit of deception, and that is okay to a point. So you can still give informed consent and give the general idea of what you're studying without fully revealing what's going to happen in the study. If you engage in deception, you do have to do what's called a debriefing immediately after the study. You have to convey to the people why you deceived them, what happened, and make sure that any discomfort they may have experienced because of the deception, that you can control it, mitigate it, and do whatever you need to get them back to the place of where they were before they participated in the study. Any questions about principle of respect for persons? Okay, the principle of beneficence. So think of the word benefit, right? That's one way to make it easy. With the principle of beneficence, this is the weighing of the risks and benefits. What we want to do is maximize the benefit to society. So what you're pursuing, you're adding to the knowledge base of what we understand about people, right? And so that is a benefit. But there are certain things that you might want to know about that maybe kind of delve into the realm of, well, it could possibly harm the participants. This is where the weighing comes in. You want to maximize the benefit to society while minimizing the harm to participants. Is there a chance that somebody on the outside will say, no, you know what? It's too risky for participants. You need to change it. And this is where the idea of it's not the topic itself that is unethical, it's the way you approach it, right? It's the way you are doing that calculation of it's really important for us to understand what's going on with this condition and how far is that understanding going to go before you are harming the people who are helping you gain this knowledge, right? That's the whole idea with the principle of beneficence. Any question about this one? Okay, and then there's the principle of justice. This goes back to that idea of those who are participating in the study should also be benefiting from the knowledge. It should not be a situation where maybe only the wealthy people are benefiting and all the risk goes to the people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, right? That's the idea of the principle of justice, that those, first of all, if you're really looking at a representative sample, you're not only going to focus on one group, right? You want to, if it's greater understanding for the larger population, then you want to have a diverse sample. And that diverse sample should include diversity of even socioeconomic status, different kinds of things like that. So the idea is fair balance among participants and beneficiaries. You should not only have one group benefiting and only one group that's being the participants who are suffering and possibly being hurt. That's the idea of the principle of justice. Any questions about this one? Okay, so respect for persons, principle of beneficence, and principle of justice. This all really came up from the Belmont report. The Institutional Review Board is something that exists for all institutions that get any kind of federal funding. So it's a federal policy, and the idea is this is a group that will protect any human subjects during a research process, right? It is interdisciplinary. So it's not only educational institutions, it also includes hospitals. It can include nonprofit organizations. So any institution that gets federal funds, if they want to conduct research, they have to have an institutional review board. The San Jose Evergreen Community College District does have an institutional review board. The purpose of this IRB is to take a look at these protocols. So when somebody wants to conduct research and they're going to, do this in one of these institutions. So if somebody wanted to conduct research, for example, at Evergreen, and Evergreen students, they would have to submit a proposal in the form of a protocol. The protocol is a very detailed paper that talks about different aspects of the study, similar to the proposal you're going to be writing, and very carefully outlining how participants are going to be treated, how their information is going to be kept confidential. What's the kind of, are you offering compensation? So this is something interesting. Compensation for participation is something that, motivates participants. We're all trying to get participants to come in. It cannot be so high that the participants feel like they can't say no, which is a really interesting way of protecting the participants, because you don't want people to be in a position where, let's say they're, so again, socioeconomically disadvantaged is a vulnerable population. If you're saying to people, okay, I'll give you $500 if you participate in my study, and in this study, I'm going to put electrodes and I'm going to shock you. Well, that's not being very ethical, right? Because what you're doing is you're drawing on people who feel like they have to say yes, even if they're scared to have these things happen to them. So that is part of the ethics, and that's part of what the Institutional Review Board will look at. Who are the participants you're drawing from? Are they a vulnerable population? Do they need extra protections? Right? So ultimately, it's you as a researcher reassuring this group of individuals that your research will be beneficial and it will not, you are minimizing the harm to anyone who participates in your study. So who's in this group? It's at least 5 people. And it's really interesting because they want a diverse group to be part of it. So it will be people with varying backgrounds, different professions, at least one scientist, non-scientists, men, women, and interestingly and importantly, at least one person who is not affiliated with the institution. And this is to ensure that, let's say the institution is, maybe it's a pharmaceutical company, and they're really going to benefit if this study happens. Well, if everybody works for the pharmaceutical company, they're going to be a little bit biased, and they're going to be less likely to be very strict on the protocol and allowing it to happen. So we always want to have at least one person in the IRB who is not affiliated with this institution, and that's going to bring in, at least reduce bias and reduce the chances of harm towards the participants. Any questions about the Institutional Review Board? Okay, so when you get the protocols, you can just imagine, like Research One University, they get many, many proposals for research. So the way that they actually make it more efficient is that people have to categorize the research they want to conduct. So first of all, there is exempt level, meaning there's absolutely no risk at all to the participants. So example of this would be a naturalistic observation in a park. Or maybe if you are conducting your research based on marriage certificates and divorce certificates, that's archival research, right? These are public documents, primary source documents. That doesn't hurt anybody. So when it's exempt, it goes very, very quickly because there's no informed consent required. And the researchers have to apply for exempt status. Once the exempt status is approved, it goes through IRB very, very quickly. Because really, remember, the purpose of the IRB is to minimize the risk to participants. So if the research proposal is categorized as exempt, then as soon as they gain that exempt status, it goes through IRB very quickly. Second level is minimal risk. So minimal risk is basically the same as, what people go through their everyday lives. So walking through a park or something like that. If the research is considered no more risky than that, then you can get minimal risk status. So an example might be getting physiological data, like having somebody get weighed, maybe a recording of a conversation, something like that, even moderate exercise. Anything that doesn't involve stress or behavior manipulation could fall under minimal risk. So here, the risk of harm is no greater than activities of normal daily life. Then you have greater than minimal risk. So there's really only three: exempt, no risk at all, right? Minimal risk, which is basically the same as people conducting their daily business. And then everything else goes under greater than minimal risk. So that is a full IRB review. So examples of greater than minimal risk could be a stress study where you put people under conditions that might, raise their heart rate, get them upset, things like that. Anything that will require people to reveal confidential information would fall under greater than minimal risk. And that includes grades, by the way. It includes health data, things like that. So that would fall under greater than minimal risk. Obtaining sensitive information, even family histories, anything that could potentially be risky for a participant will fall under greater than minimal risk. So that will be a full IRB review. And it might be that they will look at it and make sure that there are special procedures in place, again, to protect the participants. So this is important for all of you to know. Make sure you understand the types of research and what falls under those categories. So it's exempt is no risk, and that would be where you're not really interacting with anybody, right? So a naturalistic observation, you're not going up to the people and asking them any questions. You're just seeing what they're doing, right? Or archival research where it's primary source documents. You are not calling them to find out about their marriage or anything like that. You're just getting information like dates and who's involved, that kind of thing, from publicly available data. That's the key there. It's not sensitive information. Archival research from publicly available data. So that's why it is no risk. Again, exempt, no risk. No informed consent is required. and researchers have to apply for the status. So in other words, there's another process to apply for this to make sure, because we want to really make sure that no one at all, there's no risk whatsoever for anybody involved in the study. That is exempt. Then you have minimal risk. So with minimal risk, you're going to apply for this status and you're going to say, okay, participants aren't really going to be hurt. We're just going to get their weight, or we're just going to get their eye color, no sensitive information. Maybe we'll record them talking to a friend just to do some analysis on a 5-minute conversation, which someone's done a 20-year program of study on that data. Maybe even having them do a little bit of a walk. Nothing that causes stress, nothing that will elevate their heart rate to a point where they might have a heart attack or anything like that. It could also be perception studies, maybe looking, okay, when do you see the flashing light, after staring at something? Those are all minimal risk. And the idea there is minimal risk means that the harm is just the same level of risk as if you're going about your day, going to school, driving, those kind of things. So minimal risk. Then the third one, which is almost everything, is greater than minimal risk. If you're obtaining any kind of sensitive data, if you are manipulating somebody's behavior, as in you're triggering stress or triggering, we were talking about this earlier, a dissociative identity disorder episode, that would fall under greater than minimal risk. And so in this situation, in your protocol, you would have to explain what you're doing to the participant and how you're going to mitigate whatever stress or whatever experience that they're going to have that is greater than minimal risk. How are you actually going to make sure that it's not more than it needs to be? And how are you going to help the people go back to the condition that they were in before they started the study? So you can just imagine that could be pages. And what could happen is you would submit the protocol. They look at what you say you're going to do, and they might say, this isn't good enough. Revise and resubmit. So with these IRB protocols, it's not often a one-shot deal. A lot of times you're going to submit it, you wait, and depending, if it's a research one in an institution, it could be a couple of months. And then they come back to you and say, we need you to provide more detail on this, or we want you to change this aspect. We don't feel like you're protecting your participants. Just understand the whole purpose of the IRB is to protect the participants. So it might be annoying to you as a researcher that you keep having to revise it, but that's a message to you that you need to think more carefully about what you are doing in your study to protect your participants. Any questions about these 3 types of risks or types of research? All right, so here, what I've done is kind of do an overlap between the Belmont report, which is much of what we've based our APA ethical principles on. So we have 5 APA ethical principles. These were established in 2002, so over 20 years ago. Principle A is beneficence and non-malfeasance, so that maps directly on the Belmont report's principle of beneficence. Fidelity and responsibility is another principle of APA, and that also falls under beneficence. And then integrity also falls under beneficence. And I'll talk about each one by itself. APA ethical principles also has justice, which maps onto the justice part. And then the 5th principle of the APA ethical principles is respect for people's rights and dignity, and that maps onto respect for persons. So in your textbook, you have the ethical standards. The ethical standards change quite often. What does not change are the ethical principles, and that's why I'm focusing on that for this class, because the principles don't change. How they are manifested in the standards of APA may change every so often, but you should understand the principles that form the basis of those standards. So it's beneficence and non-malfeasance, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for people's rights and dignity. Let's look at each one. So beneficence and non-malfeasance. you've never heard the word before, you can break it down. So beneficence, as I told you, you can think of the word benefit. So what good is going to come from it? Non-malfeasance, right? Non kind of is negating. And then malfeasance, mal means bad. So nothing bad. So that's what really we're looking at. What is beneficial? And how are we preventing bad things from happening to our participants? So the idea behind this principle is that people or society should benefit, but you are not going to cause suffering to your participants. That's what the non-malfeasance part. So the beneficence part refers to people or society that through your research, you're going to provide information that is going to benefit others. Non-malfeasance refers to your participants. You are trying as much as possible not to harm them. That's that principle. Fidelity and responsibility, that goes back to the researcher. The researcher is supposed to establish trust, right? Be trustworthy for the participants and for those who are, anybody who's really involved with the research study. Responsible behavior. So if you're dealing with a vulnerable population, you're going to do what you can to take care of them. You're not going to exploit them. That's that idea of responsible behavior. Integrity, that goes back to data, right? This is be accurate and truthful. If you have integrity as a researcher, you're not going to falsify your data. That's what really the accurate and truthful part. If you have a hypothesis and the results from your data don't support your hypothesis, then you should be forthcoming with that. Maybe it doesn't support your hypothesis because the manipulation wasn't strong enough. Or maybe, you didn't have a diverse enough sample or a large enough sample. There are many reasons why a hypothesis may not be supported. But ultimately, you as a researcher have the ethical responsibility to report the truth. You're not supposed to fabricate your data or change the data so that your hypothesis is supported. Justice, we talked about this one already. The idea is that you should treat all groups fairly, right? You shouldn't not be targeting a group that is vulnerable, and participants should be from the same group as those benefiting. So again, you should not be looking at a vulnerable population who really needs money, or maybe children who don't know any better. The people who are benefiting from the research should actually be reflective of those who are participating in the research. Respect for people's rights and dignity. This goes back to the idea that people should be informed about what they're going to be experiencing in your study. They should have the right to privacy. So if they are releasing any kind of confidential information or sensitive information, you are going to protect it. Also, confidentiality. So these are some aspects that the IRB will look at. If you're collecting data, even academic data is considered confidential, sensitive information. How are you going to protect it? How are you going to ensure that this data that you're getting about your participants doesn't go out into the public domain, isn't traced back to them or anything like that? So these are aspects of the protocol that you need to explicate very carefully as a researcher, that you've thought about these aspects and that you're going to take care of each one for your participants. Any questions about this one so far? Okay, so that's kind of the translation of the principle and what it means, right? 5 principles, you should know them very well, be able to distinguish from among all of them. Okay, beneficence and non-malfeasance. The way to summarize that is do no harm, right? Remember, there are 3 levels of study, and 3 levels of risk in the study. So you need to consider that. Types of risks are psychological harm, physical harm, and loss of confidentiality. Those are 3 main types of risks that we need to consider as researchers. And that is what the IRB is going to look at. Is there any possibility that you're going to permanently psychologically harm your participants? Are you going to physically harm your participants? And this could come from like a stress study where you're making them go on a treadmill faster and faster or something like that. You want to make sure you're not going to push someone so hard that they get a heart attack, for example. And then loss of confidentiality is also a risk. If you're collecting information like health data or academic data, you want to make sure that you're taking steps to maintain the confidentiality for your participants. What are the benefits? Well, sometimes it could be an educational benefit. Maybe the participants might even get a new skill based on your study, depending on how you do it. A huge benefit could be if they're receiving psychiatric treatment or medical treatment. So one component you should be aware of ethically, let's say you want to try a new medication. If participants are going to benefit from it, you cannot ethically keep it from people who will benefit. So in that situation, you're not going to have an experimental group and control group in the sense that the control group never gets that benefit. What you could have is that the control group receives it later. So it's staggered instead, so that everyone eventually will benefit from receiving the treatment. But in order to determine if the treatment's even effective, right? Maybe the control group at first will get what we call placebo, and we'll talk about that later. And then receive the actual treatment later. So that is one change in terms of ethics, is that if we are sure that there is some kind of treatment that will benefit people, you can't keep them from it. What you could do is probably after the study, offer the treatment to them as well for those who are in the control group, or else stagger their exposure to that component so that you can still obtain the data of what it was like for them when they weren't exposed to the treatment. Any questions about Principle A? Okay, oops, I'm just gonna go back. So fidelity and responsibility, we talked about that one. So integrity, this one, sometimes people are a little confused with this one. Again, the idea with integrity is you're not going to fabricate your data or misrepresent your data. So fraud is what we call fabrication of data. It's not very common. A lot of times it's detected when the findings can't be replicated. If somebody comes up with findings that are so unusual, and it's really impactful and nobody can replicate it, then the data might be questioned. So more and more, a lot of funding agencies will require that the data set you have has to be available to other researchers. And that way we can continue this replication idea. The other way we kind of try to mitigate fraud is through the peer review process. So when you collect your data and you have your results and everything, you write it up in a research paper, a formal research paper, and you submit it for review to other experts in the field. And a lot of times that's when people can detect if there's a problem with your design or your data. And then plagiarism is another problem with integrity. Claiming another person's work as your own. I would extend this now to AI, right? We've talked about this in AI's artificial intelligence, and maybe some plagiarism mechanisms like Turnitin.com might not be able to pick up on AI generated work, but there are AI detectors, which I do use. And the idea is that AI is a tool. It's a tool that's supposed to help you become more productive. Using it and claiming it as your own is not ethical. It is considered cheating, right? That's not integrity. Now you can use it to help you refine some work. It can help brainstorm. Brainstorming is a great use of AI, but ultimately you are responsible for what you turn in. And you should be transparent and tell people if you are using AI to help you in any kind of product you make. So this goes back to the idea of integrity, the idea of not plagiarizing, the idea of not claiming other work as your own. That's what it goes back to. Any questions about integrity? Right, so informed consent. We've heard this term a few times now. So it used to be that informed consent was this long paper that participants had to read, and sort of like the student contract that I have you look at, where, there are different components of the study and that they understand what they're signing up for, right? So unfortunately, think of informed consent as the end user agreement when you download an app. What's the problem with that? How many of you actually read every single aspect of the end user agreement when you download a free app? We see a very small percentage. Probably true for many participants, but again, we are trusting that people are autonomous individuals and are voluntarily signing up for it, right? So there's kind of that part too, is it's also respecting people as adults who can make these decisions. And by the way, children cannot do informed consent. They can, over the age of 7, it's called assent, ASSENT, but it is their legal guardians who have to sign the informed consent. But over the age of 7, we believe that children are old enough to understand what they're getting involved in, and so they have to agree to be part of the study as well. Under the age of 7, it's totally up to the legal guardians. So for informed consent, you have to include the research purpose, how long it will take, what's going to happen, any risks and benefits is clearly outlined, and if there's any compensation and how confidentiality is going to be maintained. The last part of the RB is an assurance of voluntary participation and right to withdraw. Here's something. If you ever participate in a study, understand that the informed consent means that if 5 minutes in the study, you don't feel like you want to participate anymore, you should be allowed to leave. And moreover, you should still be able to get the compensation. That's part of it. So a lot of researchers don't like to highlight that part, but I think you should be aware of it. Also, the last part of informed consent is contact information for questions. The problem with informed consent is oftentimes it's something electronic, you might sign it, and then you never see it again. So take a screenshot or download your end user agreements. Any of those things, you should have some sort of way of preserving it so that you can go back and find out who it is that you can contact if there's a problem. Really important to consider that. If it's a piece of paper, take a picture of it, right? Take a picture of the researcher's name and the contact information. All of these things are important to hold on to in case something should happen later, you have some recourse. Really important to consider that. Any questions about informed consent? Okay, some issues. Well, if you want to study psychology, you might be concerned that informed consent is going to reveal so much about the study that it's going to affect the outcome of the study, right? It could bias the sample. And so this is why sometimes psychologists will engage in deception. So deception might include using confederate. A confederate is somebody who the participants think are, regular people like them, but actually they're working for the researcher. So you can engage in a certain level of deception that needs to be clear in your protocol. And you also have to make it clear that you are going to debrief your participants, that you're going to inform them after the fact what happened, why you deceived them, what the true purpose of your study was. And so again, this goes back to the IRB. They're going to read your protocol. They're going to see that you're going to engage in deception, and they, as a group, as a committee, are going to decide, is this acceptable? Is the risk of deceiving the participants, is it minimal enough that we still think there's going to be an amount of benefit to society that it's okay, right? So that's really, you are the first level where as a researcher, you're coming up with this idea, but they're going to not just trust your judgment, but that's why they have this committee to decide further if the participants are still going to be safe in participating in your study. So justice is that idea, are all participants equal? Again, I mentioned this before, we have vulnerable populations. So here is a list of who are considered parts of vulnerable populations. So patients who are racial or ethnic minorities, children, elderly, prisoners, socioeconomically disadvantaged, underinsured, or those with certain medical conditions. These are all considered vulnerable populations. So if you want to focus on any of these groups, you, in your proposal, in your protocol, you have to justify why are these the populations you want to study? What is it different about them that you might learn from focusing on this group? And how are you going to protect them? How are you going to make sure that they are not exploited in your study? That's really ultimately what it boils down to. And finally, so these are the psychology experiments that you are going to be responsible for knowing. So in the discussion, you only have to pick one, but you have to actually know the details about all of them. So I'm going to post these slides in our Canvas shell. There are links to videos. Little Albert experiment, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, Milgram's obedience experiment, and the Stanford prison experiment. All of these have to do with ethics, questionable ethics. That's why we're talking about it. And what I want you to do is actually go back to those APA, 5 APA principles and think about how each of these studies attended to them or did not attend to them. That's really what it boils down to. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Are there any questions? Stop the